Today, I'm going to be covering some basic endgame tips for beginners. Endgames are the most decisive part of the game, so hopefully this will help you get some wins. Tip number 1. If you are down material, try to avoid trades and getting into an endgame. Vice versa, if you're up material, try to trade and get into an endgame. Let me give you an example to make it more obvious. In this position, white is up a pawn, so the correct plan is to try to trade off all of the pieces possible, because material advantage is much more important in the endgame. Usually in king and pawn endgames, if you're up just one pawn, you can win the game. That brings me to rule number 2. It's usually very useful if you can create a pass pawn. Pass pawn is a pawn that cannot be stopped by any enemy pawn on its route to promotion. So if there was a pawn either on a7, b7, or c7, this would not be a pass pawn. The pawn on f3 is not a pass pawn because the pawn on g7 is blocking its path. Pass pawns are very useful plans in the endgame because you're trying to promote to a piece that has more value. So how do we use that in our initial exercise? That brings me to rule number 3, which is creating a passed pawn from a pawn majority. In this position, we have 3 pawns versus black's 2 pawns on the king side. So what you're trying to do is somehow trade one of them off so that you create a passed pawn. I'll go forward a few moves to show that idea. So let's say you start marching your pawn towards where you want to trade it. The kings are always active in endgames, and eventually you're able to trade one of your pawns, and now we have a passed pawn. I'll quickly show you how white would win this endgame just because it applies to a lot of other positions as well. When you're up a pawn in a king and pawn endgame and it's a passed pawn, what you can usually do is make your opponent basically run out of moves to the point where you can keep marching your pawn forward, and when it gets close enough, you could actually sacrifice it and then go pick up some of your opponent's enemy pawns. I'll play some moves out because it makes a lot more sense when you see it. So black starts doing all of their pawn moves, now they're stuck, and basically you're just waiting for their king to be forcibly pushed back. You can get your pawn closer to promotion and then eventually just give it up as a sacrifice, go get the rest of the pawns, because usually your opponent will be too slow, and then you will win in terms of being able to promote first. Speaking of passed pawns, that takes me to rule number 4, which is the square rule. The square rule helps you figure out quickly if your king can catch an enemy pawn. Let's say you're playing with the black pieces here. White is trying to get to promote on a8. It's black's turn to move. Do you catch the pawn? There's a really quick way to know, and the way you do it is you draw a diagonal line from the enemy pawn all the way to where it would promote, and then you use that to complete a square. If your king would step into the square, then that means you'll catch the pawn. If it doesn't, you won't. So here, king e5, a5, king d6, a6, king c6, a7, king b7, and you catch the pawn right as it promotes. That brings us to rule number 5, which is activate your king in the endgame. Unlike the opening, there are far fewer pieces in the endgame, so usually your king is not in threat if it's going and adventuring outside. Let me show you this position. If the king is on d4 and white to move, white wins. If the king is on f2 and white to move, it's a draw. Usually, if one side has their king active and the other side doesn't, that is going to mean a win for the side that has the active king. This position is winning for white because the king can go to c5 and attack the pawn on b5 twice. Let's say the black king was more active and instead of being on h7, it was on d6. Then it would have opposition with the king and this position would be a draw. Now let me show you a more complicated example that also illustrates king activity. White to move, should white move rook c1? The answer is no, because if you move rook c1, that forces the white king back, and black's king activity is going to actually help black win this game. You end up in this position, and then the endgame is a little bit complicated, but it is winning for black. The last tip is understanding opposition. In this position, if it's black's turn to move, then white has opposition. That means that black would be the one who is forced to move away. If it was white's turn to move, then that means black has opposition. It feels really abstract, so I'm going to give you an example that shows why that's important. Here's an example where opposition is very handy. If it's white's turn to move, then black has the opposition and black can draw the game. If it's black's turn to move, then white has the opposition and white can actually win the game. This endgame is a little complicated, so I will just simplify it. But let's say it was white to move, the white king would move over, and opposition is so important because it can help you force the enemy king away. Black would continue to chase the white king around, and it'd be impossible for the white king to make progress. Now, if it was black's turn to move in this position, let's say the king would be forced to go to d6 or to f6, then the white king would progress on the opposite side, and this is actually a winning endgame where white will end up being able to promote. Please let me know in the comments if you have any feedback or if there's any other educational videos you'd like to see. Also, if you want to support the channel, we have these hoodies and our own custom chessboards at botezlive.shop. Thanks for watching!